Look, I think it's time I showed the Winnipeg Jets some love, as I've rarely talked about them at all on the channel. But a perfect Jet story to tell dates all the way back to 1972, when the Jets of the WHA would sign the Golden Jet himself to a massive contract, bringing him over from the NHL. Now, this move was more significant in more ways than one. We all know this move would eventually put the WHA on the map, but there was another reason as to why the Jets did this. When the teams in the WHA were adding to their rosters, the Oilers would snag several NHLers, and the Jets, in an attempt to one-up them, basically signed Hull as a response to Edmonton, and this one deal would spark a rivalry like none other. Winnipeg would also do something that not many teams thought of, and this actually was the difference maker at the beginning of it all, as Winnipeg would add key additions from Europe that would bolster the team's firepower. Ulf Nilsson and Anders Hedberg would be paired up with Bobby Hull, and this tandem was so deadly that it was what influenced Oilers GM Glenn Sather to mold his Oilers of the 80s the way he did. The Jets would dominate the WHA, winning 3 Avco World Trophies in 4 years, including winning the final World Trophy against none other than the Oilers in 6 games in 1979. With the league down to just 6 teams by the end of the 79 season, the WHA would merge into the NHL, bringing both Winnipeg and Edmonton into the league, and ironically into the same division. But Edmonton would bring in a kid by the name of Wayne Gretzky, who would shift the balance of power in the rivalry between the teams. Gretzky was actually almost a Jet, but Oilers owner Peter Pocklington would outbid the Jets, snagging Wayne from the then folding Indianapolis Racers. And boy did the Jets wish they had that opportunity again, as Gretzky would help turn Edmonton into a juggernaut. Beginning in 1983, Edmonton and Winnipeg would meet 6 times in the postseason, and Edmonton would win every series, including a very controversial one in 1990, when after Wayne's departure to LA, the Jets and Oilers would square off, with the Jets leading the series 3-2. In Game 6, after the Jets came back from a 3-1 deficit, a fan decided to throw popcorn onto the ice, delaying the game. And get this, once the game resumed, Yari Curry would score and would help Edmonton win Game 6, and ultimately the series. I wish I could find the exact clip of the fan throwing the popcorn on the ice, but it seems that every highlight reel that's been shown cuts it out for whatever reason. Edmonton would win a total of 5 cups throughout the rivalry to Winnipeg's 0, and unfortunately the rivalry would be put to a stop after the Jets would announce their relocation to Arizona in 1996. There have been other NHL rivalries that date way back in time, but before we dive deep into those, I have to give a huge shout out to today's sponsor, Manscaped. Manscaped hooked me up with a bunch of tools and formulations from their Perfect Package 3.0 kit, which comes with everything you need to keep trimmed, cut free, and smelling nice down there. The kit is highlighted by the Lawnmower 3.0, which is a one-of-a-kind trimmer that features a cutting-edge ceramic blade which reduces grooming accidents thanks to their advanced skin-safe technology. In addition, it also comes with a very helpful waterproof LED light that makes your shower shaves nice and easy. Inside the kit also comes the Crop Preserver, which is basically a deodorant for your family jewels. Pair the Crop Preserver with the Crop Reviver and you'll prevent excess sticking and sweating, feeling cool, relaxed, and relieved. Finally, Manscaped also threw in 2 free gifts as well. Gifts that include a pair of boxer briefs alongside of a handy travel shed bag. Personally, I felt a lot better since using Manscaped products, and you can too. If this is something that may interest you, then head to manscaped.com and use my promo code IDGT for 20% off and free international shipping. The link will also be in the description below. Once again, big thanks to Manscaped for the sponsor. Now let's get back into the video. When talking about this next rivalry, you need to know one particular year. Now, why is 1940 significant, you may ask? Well, after the Rangers would win the Cup in 1940, they would have to wait another 54 years before finally hosting another one over their heads. And in the meantime, another team in New York would be brought in during the 70s that would find success, especially against the Rangers. Although the Islanders struggled like any other expansion team did at the beginning of their tenure, once the 1980s began, the Isles with a core that featured the likes of Mike Bossy, Brian Trottier, and Billy Smith would absolutely tear apart the NHL. Helping the club win 4 consecutive Stanley Cups from 1980 to 1983. In the 1981 semifinals between the 2 New York teams, the Isles would lay a beating on the Rangers, sweeping them in 4 games, eventually going on to win the Cup. But all throughout that series, the chants of 1940s began erupting from the stands, thus angering the Rangers even more. And soon, other fans began to pick up the taunts, and fans from all teams enjoyed chirping the Rangers. But Rangers fans had some chants of their own, including DP sucks, referring to former Islanders netminder Rick DiPietro, and of course, the infamous On February 25th, 1979, the Rangers seemed on cruise control offensively, hammering the Islanders with shots. Rangers young star Ulf Nilsson looked extremely promising, and fans had high hopes for the skilled forward. Well, Islanders defenseman Dennis Potvin decided to have his way with Nilsson and would absolutely crush him, resulting in Ulf breaking his ankle. And thus the iconic chant was born, and is still even heard as of today, as afterwards, Nilsson would never be the same player that he was prior to the hit, causing many Rangers fans to wonder what could have been if Nilsson remained healthy. There's always been a big brother little brother aspect that's been evident throughout the rivalry, as the Rangers seem to be the buzz in the Big Apple, while the Islanders seem to be pushed aside, which isn't exactly fair. But although the Islanders had their success in the 80s, in terms of overall success, the Rangers have them beat, winning the all-time series and having the most recent success, appearing in the Eastern Conference Final in 2012 and 2015, and even the Stanley Cup Final in 2014. The Rangers and Islanders rivalry may be heated, but perhaps not as heated as the one that brews in Pennsylvania, as the Battle of Pennsylvania has provided so many memorable moments that it's hard to highlight them all, but we'll try our best to go over what we can. First, you can't talk about the cross-state rivalry without mentioning Philly's impressive streak, as from 1974 to 1989, the Flyers would win 42 consecutive home games against the Penguins with a record of 39-0-3, putting together one of the most impressive streaks in professional sports history. Also, Philly would strike blood in terms of overall success, as they take home back-to-back cups in 74 and 75, becoming infamously known as the rough and tough Broad Street Bullies. Pittsburgh knows a thing or two about going back-to-back, however, as they'd win 4 out of their 5 championships in back-to-back fashion, winning in 1991 and 1992, 2009, and 2016 and 2017. Believe it or not, both teams wouldn't meet up in the postseason until 1989, and mind you, both teams arrived at the same exact time as a part of the Great Expansion in 1967, so both teams had to wait 22 years before squaring off in the playoffs, but boy was the wait ever worth it, as the 1989 Patrick Division Final may go down as one of the most iconic matchups in the rivalry's history. And of course the series would go 7 games. After the first 3 games were decided by 1 goal, games 4 through 7 were much different. Game 5 featured a disastrous 10-7 win by the Penguins, which was highlighted by Mario Lemieux going absolutely bananas, giving the Penguins a 3-2 series lead, but Game 6 would go to Philly as Tim Kerr would get his revenge in a 6-2 win. Philadelphia goaltender Ron Hextall will be out for Game 7, and Pittsburgh thought the series was in the bag. That is, until backup goalie Ken Riggett stopped 39 of 40, helping Philly win the game and the series in one of the most thrilling ways possible. Philly would also get another exciting win against the Penguins in the 2000s playoffs, as in Game 4 of the series, Keith Primo would score the game-winning goal in the 5th overtime, tying the series 2 games apiece, only for Philly to lose the series in 7 games. Other memorable moments include coaches Dan Blyzma and Peter Laviolette's heated exchange days before the 2012 playoffs, Claude Giroux's 2012 shift, and Mario Lemieux's goal against the Flyers in his last NHL game. This next rivalry started thanks to one play, but in order to understand how we got here, we need to rewind a bit. On December 2nd, 1995, the Red Wings would score a whopping 9 times on Habs goaltender Patrick Roy, who was clearly frustrated afterwards on the bench. Well, he would tell Montreal it was his last game as a Canadian and requested a trade, being shipped off to the newly located Colorado Avalanche. Also now a member of the Avs would be 1995 Conn Smythe winner Claude Lemieux, who was already a nemesis as his Devils would defeat the Wings that year in the final. Both Lemieux and Roy would play a big role in the soon-to-be rivalry, one that happened thanks to one hit.
And they can't come up with it. Coffey will stop it. No, he won't. They missed it at the blue line, so they have to snap it back outside. And a penalty is going to be called, and it's going to be Lemieux again, I think. The Red Wing player near the bench was dropped.
Game 6 of the 1996 Western Conference Final would go down in infamy as Avs Claude Lemieux would hammer Red Wings Chris Draper into the boards with one of the nastiest hits in postseason history. Draper would be badly injured, breaking multiple bones in his body and suffering from a concussion. What makes things worse for Detroit was that the Avalanche would win the game and ultimately the Stanley Cup, causing instant bad blood between both teams that boiled over as the years went on. The following season, the two teams would meet 4 times in the regular season. The first 3 meetings were feisty, but nothing major would ensue. But the 4th and final meeting between the two on March 26, 1997 would become known as the notorious Bloody Wednesday.
Mike Vernon with a great left, follows up with the right. They are on their feet here at Joe Louis Arena.
A scrum would ensue between Peter Forsberg and Igor Larionov, two very unlikely opponents, but what ensued the chaos was when Wings forward Darren McCarty would jump onto Lemieux, pounding him to a pulp. Shanahan would then pancake goaltender Patrick Waugh, but he didn't stop Waugh from getting to his opponent Mike Vernon. And soon, everyone was fighting everyone, and a goalie battle would even ensue. Eventually, both teams realized a game was being played, and who else but Darren McCarty to score the game winner, helping Detroit win Bloody Wednesday 6-5. Detroit would win their first of eventual 2 back-to-back cups, and in 2001, the Avalanche would take home their second cup, evening out the wins 2-2. However, a year later, the Wings in 2002 would win with one of the most dominant cores ever assembled, beating the Avalanche in cup victories by 1. This rivalry may be the most dominant of the bunch, as both teams were evenly matched, with star power on both ends of the rivalry, backing it up with winning. And while we're on the topic of dominance, let's head to Edmonton, as our next rivalry is another thriller.
Albert and Smith, who've been on both sides of this Battle of Alberta. This is unbelievable. Wow.
Who can forget the Battle of Alberta, a rivalry that has brought us so many memorable moments it's hard to keep track of, but again, I'll do my best to cover the most important. Let's get started with the obvious. This rivalry didn't start until 1980, and that's because before the Flames arrived in Calgary, they were known as the Atlanta Flames. The Flames resigned in Atlanta from 72 to 79, but wouldn't find much success until arriving in Calgary. Conveniently enough, 1980 was also the year where the Edmonton Oilers would arrive from the WHA. With both teams from the same province coming in at the same time, the two would try to compete to be known as the best of Alberta. In just their first ever meeting, things would get wild, as Flames Jim Peplinski would drop the gloves with 19-year-old Mark Messier in Edmonton, earning himself a fighting major. The next brawl would occur months later in Calgary, as 4 different players earned minors for leaving the bench, and 5 others got fighting majors. This was just a preview of what was to come. Physically, that is. As much as these two teams hated each other, they were also extremely talented. This caused the two to meet up in the postseason quite often, and they had their fair share of memorable moments. But nothing like one in particular in 1986, as Oilers defenseman Steve Smith would score one of the most iconic goals in the rivalry's history, for the wrong team. From 1983 to 1990, one of the two Albertan teams would appear in the final, and because of Steve Smith's goal, it helped Calgary advance further into the postseason, eventually making the final, but losing out to Montreal. Fast forward to 2003, and Calgary had a 4-goal lead on Edmonton in the Saddle Dome, rekindling the rivalry as Flames fans, including Harvey the Hound, would make sure the Oilers knew how bad they were down. Well, Oilers coach Craig McTavish wasn't having it that night, and when the Flames mascot attempted to taunt McTavish by bending over the glass, Coach T would pull out Harvey's tongue for one of the most hilarious moments throughout the rivalry's history. Of course, then you factor Iginla's physicality playing a role as the 2000s resumed, and later Jordan Eberle in the 2010s, and even though those teams were going through rough patches, those players allowed heated exchanges to pile up. Once Edmonton drafted Connor McDavid in 2015, and Calgary had Gaudreau and Kachuk blossom in the Stars, the rivalry was exciting once again, as we've been able to witness the Kassian and Kachuk duels, and even a modern-day, extremely watered-down Bloody Wednesday, with Smith and Talbot dropping the mitts. This rivalry was exciting and brutal, just like another rivalry in another part of Canada. The Montreal Canadiens have had a ton of enemies, so this last part of today's video will be broken into 3 sections, each section talking about a Montreal rivalry with a different opponent. First, entering the same Providence rival, the Quebec Nordiques, as the two would take part in one of the most brutal altercations in league history. After previously facing off against one another 2 years prior in the 1982 playoffs, the two would meet up again in 1984, and after Montreal went up 3-2 in the series, Game 6 would become the bloodiest matchup in the Battle of Quebec. The fighting began as the second period was set to expire. After Guy Carbonneau was pinned to the ground by Dale Hunter, more than 10 minutes of brawling would commence, with a total of 222 penalty minutes being distributed. 10 players would be thrown out of the game, but because the refs couldn't jot down all the penalties in the intermission, some players didn't know they were suspended, which would once again cause another 10-minute bench clearing after the announcements were finally made. The number of total penalty minutes after the game was 250, making it one of the craziest fights in NHL NHL history. Sadly, the rivalry would end in 1995 as the Nordiques would announce their relocation to Colorado, eventually starting the rivalry in Detroit. But no one will forget the crazy moments that took place between the two clubs. Now, let's go to Montreal's other Canadian rival, the Toronto Maple Leafs. And this dates back all the way to 1938, as once the Maroons folded, Toronto and Montreal were the only Canadian teams remaining in the NHL, causing both teams to want to earn the title of being the best team in Canada. The 1940s and 60s were dominated by both teams, and it was also the time when the hate between the two teams began to stir up. In 1946, Leafs assistant manager Frank Selke would leave the organization, joining the rival Canadiens. It was reported he'd done so due to ongoing tensions with managing director Conn Smythe, and this angered Toronto, but perhaps they got their revenge a few decades later, as in 1967, they would embarrass Montreal in the most amazing way possible. Montreal was set to host Expo 67. If you're not familiar with Expo, basically it's a world fair of sorts where companies showcase their products and promote their brand. Well, since it was being hosted in Montreal, the Habs were so confident that they'd beat the Leafs that they booked an exhibit space to show off the Stanley Cup. Problem is, they'd never win it, as the Leafs would upset them in the final, making it the last time the Leafs won the cup. After 67, the rivalry cooled down for a brief time, and in fact has sort of cooled down altogether, as Montreal and Toronto haven't met up in the playoffs since 1979, and Montreal sort of took the stranglehold on Toronto in terms of overall success, winning the all-time series against Toronto in both the regular season and the postseason. Although the rivalry between Montreal and Toronto was a grand one, nothing compares to the feud between the Habs and Bruins that actually took a while to brew up. The Bruins were the first American team to enter the league in 1924, and after the Maroons left in 1938, it caused Boston to enter the same division as Montreal. Even after being added, however, the rivalry didn't start until 1955, when the infamous Richard riots would take place. Bruins defenseman Hal LaCoy, a former member of the Habs, would high-stick Rocket Richard, causing a delay of game penalty to be called. Richard, being upset, approached LaCoy and hit him with his stick, and when being held back by the referee, he would punch the ref twice in the face, eventually leaving the ice. NHL Commissioner Clarence Campbell would give Richard a suspension for the remainder of the season, enraging Montreal fans, who wanted LaCoy to face punishment as well. Campbell announced he would be attending the next Montreal game, and he'd be booed by the fans, being pelted with numerous foods. A tear gas bomb would be set, and thus the riots began. Richard himself had to tell the fans to stop, and promised a Stanley Cup when he would return. And funny enough, a year later, he did just that. But ever since, the hatred between the both clubs would continue to boil over. Boston and Montreal would be in 16 of the 30 Stanley Cup finals from 1965 to 1979, and most fans remember how Montreal was able to stop a potential Bruins dynasty in the 1971 playoffs, thanks to goaltender Ken Dryden putting on a show in Game 7. The Bruins would form their lunch pail gang with Don Cherry, whose classic blunder in 1979 caused his Bruins to lose in Game 7 after a too-many-men penalty led to a Guy Lafleur game winner. The Bruins wouldn't beat Montreal in the playoffs again until 1988, making it their first victory in 45 years versus the club. And in 2004, Montreal would beat Boston after coming back from a 3-1 deficit. Even as of the 2010s, the rivalry has had significant moments, but in the end, although these two teams have gone through a hell of a lot, their rivalry can be summarized by one photo from 1952, as Richard would score the game winner after being banged up with blurry vision, scoring on Bruins netminder Sugar Henry, and the two would shake hands when all was said and done, creating one of the best photos in sports history. There's still so many rivalries I wasn't able to go over that I'll talk about briefly. Rivalries that include Rangers vs. the Devils, highlighted by Messier's guarantee, Matteau's overtime winner, and Henry's revenge. Detroit vs. Chicago that eventually faded due to the Wings being moved to the Eastern Conference. The Blues and Blackhawks that involved numerous playoff affairs and the infamous St. Patrick's Day massacre. And finally, Toronto vs. Boston that some say began the moment Eddie Shore injured Ace Bailey, but nowadays fans only link this rivalry to one simple clip. Hockey is one of the most physical sports in the world, and rivalries only add fuel to the fire, hence why the fans enjoy them so much. And rivalries can always continue to be formed, as based on what we learned in today's video, all it takes is one hit, punch, or exchange between the opposition to lead to decades of bitterness and moments for the books.
No more 1940! Yeah!
People of New York will never, ever, ever have to hear 1940 ever again.